From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story touches you, please consider subscribing to support more stories that honor the unsung heroes among us. James Murphy sat alone at table 12, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he counted the crumpled bills spread across the white tablecloth. The elegant atmosphere of Romano's fine dining seemed to mock his simple appearance, his worn brown jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed work boots telling a story of a life lived far from luxury. Around him the restaurant buzzed with the soft conversations of well-dressed patrons. Designer handbags hung from chairbacks, gold watches caught the chandelier light, and the unmistakable confidence of wealth filled the air. At the neighboring table, a businessman in a $1,000 suit was explaining his latest investment to his companions, his voice carrying easily across the intimate space. James had chosen this restaurant carefully. It wasn't about the food, though Romano's was renowned throughout Chicago for its exceptional cuisine. It was about the memory. 30 years ago, on this very date, something had happened here that changed everything. Today he had returned to honor that memory, even if it meant spending money he couldn't really afford. The waiter, a young man named David Chen, approached with practiced professionalism. At 25, David had been working at Romano's for 3 years, putting himself through culinary school while supporting his younger sister's education. He'd seen all types of customers, from generous celebrities to demanding socialites, but something about the elderly man at table 12 made him pause. "Good evening, sir," David said warmly, placing a leather-bound menu before James. "Welcome to Romano's. Can I start you with something to drink?" James looked up, his gray eyes meeting David's with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Just water, please, and could I see the menu? I know this might sound strange, but I'd like to order exactly what someone ordered here 30 years ago." David's eyebrows rose slightly, but his training kicked in. "Of course, sir. What would that be?" "The lamb special with mint sauce, garlic potatoes, and a slice of chocolate cake." James's voice carried a weight that spoke of significance beyond a simple meal. It was someone's favorite. Across the restaurant, Margaret Blackwood, the wife of a prominent Chicago attorney, nudged her husband. "Harold, look at that man. What is he doing here? This isn't a soup kitchen." Harold Blackwood glanced over, his expression immediately shifting to one of disdain. "Probably can't even afford the breadbasket. Romano should have better screening." Their whispers weren't as quiet as they thought. James heard them, felt the familiar sting of judgment, but he'd endured worse. He'd endured 30 years of worse. David returned with the water and took the order, noticing how James's hands shook slightly as he folded the menu. There was something about this man that reminded him of his own grandfather, a dignity that poverty couldn't diminish, a story written in every line of his weathered face. "The lamb special is an excellent choice, sir," David said genuinely. "It's one of our signature dishes." As David walked away, James pulled out a small worn photograph from his jacket pocket. In it, a young man in a firefighter's uniform stood next to a woman in a wedding dress, both beaming with joy. The edges were frayed from years of handling, but the image remained clear, a moment of pure happiness frozen in time. The businessman at the next table was now discussing his latest acquisition, his voice loud enough to carry. "Picked up another property downtown. Sometimes I wonder what people did before entrepreneurs like us came along to develop these areas. Probably just sat around waiting for handouts." James's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when the people doing the talking had no idea what real struggle looked like. David returned with the meal, beautifully presented on fine china. The lamb was perfectly cooked, the potatoes golden and fragrant, everything exactly as James remembered. As he took his first bite, tears welled in his eyes. "Sarah, my love," he whispered to the empty chair across from him. "I'm here, just like I promised." The meal progressed slowly. James savored every bite, lost in memories of a time when his world was whole. Around him the restaurant continued its elegant dance, servers gliding between tables, wine being poured, quiet laughter mixing with the gentle sound of classical music. But the peace was shattered when James asked for the check. David approached with the leather folder containing the bill. Absolutely perfect. He opened the folder, and his face fell. The total was $127.50, significantly more than the $43 he had managed to scrape together. His pension check wouldn't arrive for another 3 days, and he had already spent his last 20 on gas to drive here from his small apartment across town. James pulled out his wallet, counting the bills again, as if somehow they might have multiplied. His hands shook more noticeably now, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead despite the restaurant's perfect temperature. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly to David. "I seem to have miscalculated. I don't have enough." David's expression softened immediately. "Sir, please don't worry about it. Let me talk to my manager. I'm sure we can work something out." But their conversation hadn't gone unnoticed. Margaret Blackwood had been watching with increasing disgust, and now she stood up, her voice carrying across the dining room. "This is exactly what I was talking about, Harold. This establishment is supposed to maintain certain standards. Now we have people coming in here who can't even pay their bills." Other diners began to turn, the gentle hum of conversation dying down as attention focused on table 12. James felt his face burning with shame, the same shame he'd carried for 30 years, the shame of being forgotten, of being judged, of being seen as less than. Romano himself, the restaurant's owner, appeared as if summoned by the commotion. Anthony Romano was a man who took pride in his establishment, but more importantly, he took pride in treating all his customers with dignity. At 62, he had built Romano's from nothing, understanding what it meant to struggle. "What seems to be the problem here?" Romano asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Margaret Blackwood didn't hesitate. "This man ordered an expensive meal he clearly cannot afford. This is not only embarrassing for him but for all of us. Surely you have policies to prevent this sort of thing." James started to stand, his legs unsteady. "I'm sorry, I'll just go. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." But David stepped forward, something in his expression changing. During the meal, he had noticed something about James, the way he carried himself, the respect in his voice when he spoke, the photograph he kept looking at. And now, as James reached for his jacket, David caught sight of something that made his breath catch. On the back of the worn brown jacket, barely visible and faded with age, was a small emblem. The emblem of Chicago Fire Department, Engine Company 19. David's father had been a firefighter. He recognized the symbol immediately, and more importantly, he recognized the station number. Engine Company 19 had been featured in local news stories, history books and documentaries. It was the station that had responded to the Romano's fire 30 years ago. "Sir," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "that jacket, are you from Engine 19? James looked up, surprised by the question. "I was. Retired now, of course." The whispers around the restaurant were getting louder, but David ignored them. His culinary school had required him to research the history of Chicago's restaurant district, and Romano's fire was legendary in the industry, not because of the damage it had caused, but because of what had happened during the rescue. "Were you here on November 15, 1994? David asked, his voice growing stronger. James nodded slowly. "Yes, I was working that night. There was a fire." The pieces were falling into place in David's mind. November 15, 1994. The night Romano's had caught fire during the dinner rush. The night when a young firefighter had made multiple trips into the burning building, saving 17 people including a young culinary student who had been trapped in the kitchen. Romano himself had gone silent, listening to the conversation with growing recognition. His eyes moved from James to David and back again, a memory 3 decades old beginning to surface. "The kitchen," Romano said suddenly, his voice filled with awe. "You saved the boy in the kitchen." James looked up, confused by the intensity in Romano's voice. "I saved several people that night. It was my job." "No," Romano said, stepping closer. "You don't understand. The boy in the kitchen, that was my son. Marco was 17, working his first job at my restaurant. You carried him out when the ceiling collapsed." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even Margaret Blackwood had stopped her complaints, sensing that something significant was happening. David was staring at James with newfound respect. "My father always told me about the heroes of Engine 19. He said you guys were legendary, that you'd run into burning buildings when everyone else was running out." But James was looking at Romano with growing recognition. Little Marco Romano. He was so scared, kept asking for his father. Romano's eyes filled with tears. "He's alive today because of you. He's married now, has 3 children. He runs our second location downtown." The transformation in the restaurant was immediate and profound. What had been whispers of judgment became murmurs of respect. The businessman who had been mocking poverty fell silent. Margaret Blackwood looked around uncomfortably, realizing that her target of disdain was something far different than she had assumed. "You saved my son," Romano continued, his voice breaking. "You saved my son, and you've been carrying his memory all these years."
That's why you're here tonight, isn't it? November 15th. James nodded, pulling out the photograph again. My wife Sarah. She died exactly 30 years ago today. Cancer. I promised her I'd have dinner at Romano's every year on our anniversary, to remember the good times. She always said the fire brought us together because I met her at the hospital afterward when I was being treated for smoke inhalation. The silence in the restaurant was complete now. Even the kitchen staff had emerged, drawn by the commotion and now standing in respectful attention. Romano placed his hand on James's shoulder. Murphy, James Murphy, Mr. Murphy, you will never pay for a meal at Romano's again. Ever, and I mean that. Romano turned to address the entire restaurant. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet a true hero. 30 years ago, this man saved 17 lives, including my son's. He ran into a burning building multiple times while everyone else ran out. The applause started slowly, with David being the first to clap. It grew gradually, then became thunderous as the entire restaurant rose to their feet.
Even Margaret Blackwood was applauding, her earlier complaints forgotten in the face of James's heroism. But Romano wasn't finished. David, call Marco, tell him to come here immediately, and call the Tribune, they need to know about this. Mr. Murphy, you're going to sit right here while we celebrate properly. James was overwhelmed, tears streaming down his face. I don't need any recognition, I just wanted to remember Sarah, and we're going to help you remember her, Romano said firmly, but we're also going to remember you. Heroes like you should never be forgotten. As the evening progressed, Marco arrived with his family. The young man who had been saved 3 decades ago was now a successful restaurateur himself, and when he saw James, he broke down completely. I remember you, Marco said, embracing James. I remember your voice in the smoke, telling me everything would be okay. You carried me out when I couldn't walk. The local news crew arrived, drawn by the story of a hero discovered. But James remained humble, deflecting praise and talking instead about his late wife, about his fellow firefighters, about the importance of community service. Margaret Blackwood approached near the end of the evening, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine contrition. Mr. Murphy, I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly, and I'm ashamed of my behavior. James looked at her with the same kindness he'd shown everyone. We all make mistakes, ma'am. The important thing is learning from them. As the evening wound down, Romano presented James with a lifetime membership to Romano's, a small plaque declaring him a true hero of Chicago, and most importantly, a promise that Sarah's memory would be honored every year on November 15th. David, who had been the catalyst for the evening's revelations, was promoted to assistant manager on the spot. His recognition of James's jacket and his respectful treatment of a customer others had dismissed demonstrated exactly the kind of values Romano wanted in his staff. But perhaps the most touching moment came when James was preparing to leave. The entire restaurant staff lined up to shake his hand, each one thanking him for his service. Romano walked him to the door, where James's old pickup truck waited in the valet area. Mr. Murphy, Romano said quietly, I want you to know that Marco thinks about you often. He named his oldest son James after you. James stopped walking, overwhelmed once again. He did. And now little James is going to grow up hearing stories about the hero he was named after. As James drove home that night, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years, a sense of belonging, of being valued, of being remembered. He had come to Romano's to honor Sarah's memory, but had discovered that his own legacy was very much alive. The story made headlines the next day. Hero firefighter honored after 30 years. But for James, the real victory wasn't the recognition. It was the knowledge that his service had mattered, that the lives he'd saved had gone on to create families, businesses, and communities. And every year since, on November 15th, James has returned to Romano's, not alone anymore, but surrounded by the extended family of people whose lives he touched. Marco brings his children, David brings his sister, and Romano ensures that the table is always perfectly set. The lesson of that evening resonated far beyond the walls of Romano's fine dining. It reminded everyone present that heroism often wears ordinary clothes, that service comes in many forms, and that the person you dismiss today might be the one who saved your life yesterday. James Murphy had walked into Romano's that night as a forgotten old man struggling to pay his bill. He walked out as a celebrated hero, surrounded by people who understood that true worth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the service we provide. And somewhere, in a frame on his kitchen table, Sarah's photograph smiles down on a life well lived, a legacy well earned, and a love that transcends time itself. Remember, true heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unappreciated. The next time you're tempted to judge someone by their appearance, remember James Murphy, and ask yourself, what stories might they be carrying?